Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're confronting the dense, disorienting, and I think profoundly radical literary landscape carved out by Kenji Siratori.
Right. Born in 1975, and he really didn't just write novels. He was forging a new path in 21st century experimental literature, fusing things like cyberpunk, posthuman philosophy, and these really viral biological concepts. You see it perfectly in his key text, Blood Electric.
Absolutely. And I think what makes Siratori so compelling, and this is really why he's more than just a stylistic innovator, is his fundamental rejection of language as a neutral tool.
Exactly. He treats it, and the material we're looking at says this perfectly, as a technological organism and a viral entity. And that immediately throws the reader into this world where the stable human subject, the one we rely on in most literature, has been just completely eroded.
And that erosion is the key. That destabilization is really the core of our conversation today. So we're going to be debating the fundamental source of Siratori's radical originality. Is his primary contribution rooted in the linguistic and syntactic deconstruction, this whole concept of language as a self-replicating infection?
And this is where I think we fundamentally diverge, is his originality derived from his construction of a new, and I mean an exceptionally detailed ontological framework, a comprehensive system of what he calls xeno-semiotics and parasitic biosemiotics. I'm going to argue that this complex theoretical architecture is the real intellectual engine of his work. The style is just the necessary output, and I'll be arguing that the power is in the execution, the linguistic erosion, and what our source material calls pathogenic poetics. It's the visceral experience of the word as virus that truly matters. For me, Siratori's genius lies in forcing the reader to undergo the very process he's describing. His power is rooted in that visceral, immediate experience of pathogenic poetics, where language isn't operating to represent reality, but as a force of parasitic transformation and recombination. The core intent here, I think, isn't philosophical contemplation. It's linguistic instability delivered right through the literary form. His texts are, they're explicitly designed to be partially unreadable. They are structured to simulate the output of multiple semiotic systems colliding, digital code, biological signals, neural noise. This means the meaning isn't just lost, it's actively weaponized.
His texts are, they're explicitly designed to be partially unreadable. They are structured to simulate the output of multiple semiotic systems colliding. I mean, look at his breakthrough text, Blood Electric. It's cited as a viral attack on narrative form. And crucially, Siratori explicitly positions language as the infection, the neural parasite of the future organism. This confirms that the target of the assault is the system of language itself, the formal structure we rely on. I believe his originality is in that relentless, formal interrogation of what happens to language when the human form is no longer the primary unit of meaning. It's a structural question. And he answers it with this relentless campaign of linguistic destabilization.
Okay, that's a powerful defense of the stylistic experience it is. But I believe you're focusing too much on the symptom, the shocking style, and you're overlooking the foundational structure that makes that style both necessary and coherent. Siratori's true breakthrough is the creation of a dense, unified theoretical architecture that rationalizes that whole style into a complete world system. He gives us xeno-semiotics, which, just to clarify for everyone, is basically a parasitic linguistic system where the normal boundaries between human language, biology, technology, they all just collapse into a single, chaotic, but fundamentally governed field. And this system is controlled by an internal logic he calls ionic vector epistemology. You can see the evidence of this systematic thought in his conceptual lexicon. Just consider the psychogamete. It's a key piece of jargon, sure, but it's precisely defined in the material as the fundamental operative unit and an infectious sign, the very definition of ontological failure. So to put it simply, the psychogamete isn't just a concept, it's the fundamental infectious thought unit that erodes identity. It is the mechanism of the narrative. And then you have mucosemiotics. I mean, here we are talking about a system where visceral secretions, sweat, blood, mucus, they become mucosal technology, the primary medium for semiotic exchange. Language isn't just spoken, it's literally carried on the body's fluids. The collapse of all these disciplinary boundaries, pulling from Bataille, Wittgenstein, quantum mechanics, genetics, that's a systematic philosophical project. It's not just a stylistic collage designed to shock us.
I agree the conceptual framework is rigorous, but let's get to the heart of it, the functional role of parasitism. If, as you argue, the systematic ontology is truly the primary thing, why does the material define the system itself by biological principles that frankly sound like they're derived from the functional necessity of the linguistic breakdown?
All environment is parasitic chaos. And crucially, Siratori reframes the parasite not as a threat, but as an integral, even functional component of the post-human system. This suggests that the condition of existence, the material ontology, is the core thing that determines how language functions, not the other way around. The body is already described as a porous territory defined by pathological transformation. Long before the text becomes chaotic, the entity it describes is already co-controlled. So language, in this view, is just describing the necessary processes of an already infected system. The corruption is biological, the language just reflects that infection.
That assumes a purely top-down, descriptive function for language that I just don't see supported by the sheer agency Siratori gives it. While the ontology is meticulously detailed, the war is fundamentally linguistic. Language is the initiating active force. Siratori clearly aligns himself with William S. Burroughs' word virus concept, emphasizing language's function as an active biological force that initiates the war of erosion from language itself. The conceptual framework, the psychogamete, the mucosemiotics, these concepts, they just serve as the chemical components in the linguistic engine. There's a material that the language virus metabolizes to perform its primary function, destroying stable meaning. The system might be the corrupted motherboard, sure, but the virus running the show is the linguistic code. The literary practice drives the theory.
See, I just have trouble with that sequence of events. If the practice drives the theory, why does the architecture of the text explicitly state the reverse? The psychogamete is defined as an emotional, biological, and semiotic unit that initiates the narrative activation of the psychogametic cyst. The narrative, the literary form itself, is therefore explicitly rendered as a biological process. It's the biolinguistics, the systematic framework, that precedes and produces the narrative form. The text tells us the cystic structure is the center of the story. That means the post-human, infected biological entity dictates the story's shape, not the writer's formal experimentation with syntax. The biology sets the rules for the semiotics.
Okay, but if the biology sets the rules, let's talk about the rule breaking, because that's where the reading experience actually happens. And this moves us perfectly to our second point, the significance of the glitch and textural excess. My argument is that the aesthetic principle of the glitch, the error, the rupture, the malfunction, that is the central, deliberate move of his originality. His texts demand this aggressive participation from the reader, who is forced to navigate what the material calls semiotic excess and fragmentation. This focus on the unreadable, on the distortion of syntax, that is the radical break from human-centered language. The texts are fundamentally about how communication fails or mutates. That's an operational concern, not a byproduct of a philosophy. The act of writing performs the mutation.
I respect the focus on the aesthetic experience, I do, but I think you're conflating the appearance of chaos with the intent of chaos. It's a compelling argument, but the glitch isn't just some arbitrary aesthetic choice designed for reader engagement. It is, instead, the symptomatic expression of the programmed failure inherent in the parasitic system. The ontological architecture Siratori builds is defined by syntactic leakage and programmatic failure. The text is diagnosed, especially in his later work like Communization, as a corresponding unreliable narrative. No dual information per cell. So the text's chaotic structure is a necessary, logical output of an infected genomic codex, not a primary artistic intent. The unreliability isn't a stylistic flourish. It is a direct, systematic result of the body being constantly rewritten by these codes. It's an inscription of the ontological state, a required error message from a corrupted system.
I appreciate that idea of the text as a required output. But that systemic approach, it fails to fully account for the intentionality of the writing practice itself. We know Siratori began his career as a writer experimenting, blending prose and poetry and abstraction. He was fascinated by the question of what happens to language when the human form is no longer the unit of meaning. That conscious initial focus on linguistic deconstruction is what defined his trajectory. He was performing posthuman poetics, the act of eroding meaning through syntax, before he solidified the complex academic lexicon of psychogametes and mucosemiotics. The desire to explore language's capacity for mutation through the act of writing preceded the comprehensive theoretical architecture that later explained it. The formal experiment was the catalyst. The theory was the retrospective map.
But that assumes the initial impulse is the same as the enduring contribution. And while I don't doubt his origin as a formal experimenter, the reason his work gets cited in academic philosophy, and not just literature, is because of the systematic framework he built around that experiment. And this brings us to our third point, the evolution of style versus the stability of theme. If linguistic practice were the central originality, that practice would need to remain consistently radical. It would prioritize erosion above all else.
But his evolution proves my point. It proves the primacy of the practice. Siratori's progression from the hypersaturated maximalism of his early works, which are almost impenetrable, to the pared-down, almost minimalistic style of later texts, that demonstrates that the mode of expression, the linguistic practice, is the variable he's constantly experimenting with. The formal instability is the defining characteristic of his career. He is constantly testing the limits of how language can operate. That capacity for formal shifting while maintaining core themes shows the linguistic experiment is the foundational motor.
I just see that differently. The evolution in style is irrelevant to the core intellectual project because the framework provides the stability. Even in those quieter moments you mention, the fundamental conceptual concerns are constant. The relationship between organism and machine, the dissolution of fixed meaning, the emergence of new forms of posthuman subjectivity, the underlying ontological framework, the posthuman body, language as virus, the collapse of identity through the psychogamete. That anchors the entire body of work, regardless of whether the output is maximalist or minimalistic. The style is just the mechanism he chooses to inscribe the prevailing ontological framework at any given moment. The framework is foundational, the style is derivative. His enduring influence isn't in the fleeting syntax of a particular text, but in creating those systematic concepts. The idea of the psychogamete, the ionic vector epistemology, that is systematic thinking.
But those systems only achieve their full radicality when they are executed through the medium of the text itself. The philosophical weight of the psychogamete is only realized when the syntax shatters, forcing the reader to feel the unit of meaning collapse under the infection. Without the relentless, visceral linguistic execution, the ontology is just dense science fiction theory. The poetic practice makes the theory live.
And I would argue that without the robust, systematic theory, the linguistic collapse is just noise. It's the clarity of the underlying structure, the explanation of why the language is collapsing, that elevates Siratori above a simple experimental writer. He provided the intellectual architecture for the noise.
So to conclude, I see Kenji Siratori as the pioneer of posthuman poetics. He executed a sustained literary experiment by making language an active pathogenic force. His work demands a confrontation with the limits of language as a human tool, and it prioritizes that transformative, often horrifying experience of semantic and syntactic collapse. His originality is the relentless commitment to writing as an act of linguistic mutation.
And conversely, I believe he should be viewed primarily as a systematic thinker, a philosopher of the future text, who architected a complex conceptual framework of parasitic biosemiotics. He defines the body as a programmable substrate and describes a world where every function is co-controlled by these defined semiotic and biological agents. His literary output, chaotic as it is the necessary nonlinear inscription of this detailed theoretical system.
Whether it's achieved through his radical linguistic erosion or his cohesive ontological mapping, Siratori's work is, I think we can agree, often described as prophetic.
Indeed. His enduring relevance really lies in compelling us to rethink the very conditions under which reading, interpretation, and subjectivity occur in the digital age. He articulated these conceptual shockwaves produced by technologies long before they fully transformed society. And whether you believe the map or the writing is paramount, he forces us to reckon with the collapse of meaning.